Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month Spotlight. And today our special spotlight is Dr. Hannah Matthys. Hi, Hannah.
Hi
How are
there.
you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited to be able to have a conversation with you. You're just absolutely one of my favorite people. And
I've seen your other ones and you say that to literally everyone. I don't know if I believe you at this point.
well, it's really true this time. It's really true. So before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit of your bio so people can get to know a little bit more about you. So you are currently Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer for the state of Colorado's Department of Labor and Employment. And you are a transracial and transnational adoptee, and you grew up in a small rural community in Wisconsin. You were born in Korea, and you earned your bachelor's in psychology and sociology from the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and you earned your PhD from CU Boulder. Go Buffs! And you focused on identity development, creating belonging, and equity. And for over 10 years, you have been teaching and facilitating around belonging and equity in college and graduate courses, conferences, and school districts, and in your own consulting company, Be Brave Diversity. And how I met you was you formerly worked in DPS in the CELT department, which culture, equity, and leadership team, facilitating equity trainings and leading the Belong groups. And something that I think is absolutely fascinating is that you are an ultimate Frisbee coach. And that is like super cool. So thanks for joining me today in your busy day today. Did you get any Frisbee in today?
I did not, and I haven't for a while, unfortunately, with social distancing and all of that.
So tell me, you used to like have to run and go coach these young ladies. Tell me, where are these athletes coming from that you coach?
So young boys and co-ed. So in the fall, it's co-ed. In the spring, I opted to coach the boys because the few female coaches we had really wanted to coach girls. And because I feel very strongly that it is really important for high school boys, especially at the highest levels, to have a strong female leader in a sport and around strategy. And so teaching them that outside of simply supporting them and caring about them, women can be fierce and competitive. So.
Is there a place that if I wanted to like start doing Frisbee, could I just go and buy a Walmart Frisbee, or is like there a special like Frisbee outlet?
So you'd go online and it's called Discraft. They're very specific ultimate discs. People don't say Frisbees.
See,
or you
like,
could just ask me.
So. I want to sound like I know. Okay, disc craft.
Yes.
Okay. That's a whole nother culture. Okay.
It really is.
Hey, so I want to get into more of your history because you're pretty open in sharing your story, which I love that you're so transparent. One of the themes that we've been talking about as we've been celebrating Asian Heritage Month is like there's no right way to be Asian. You know, my work with Asian Heritage Camp really taught me that, and to be a lot more aware that everybody has their own experience, everybody has their own story, and your story is one of the most fascinating that I've heard as an adoptee. Can you tell us more about the makeup of your family?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And so I was the first adopted in my family and the only Asian to be adopted. And so I was adopted from Korea when I was 6 months old. Both of my parents are white and lived in a tiny rural community in the woods in Wisconsin. And so very small, very in the northwest side. And then my parents also later adopted my older brother from Brazil. And my two younger brothers, who are not blood related, but are, I think, 6 months apart, I should know that, from Chicago. And at that point, it was called the inner city of Chicago, meaning Black and low income. And then my little sister was adopted from Haiti. And so it was a really interesting, it's interesting to go back and look at it. There was quite a bit of color blindness that is still very popular. Color blindness is that idea that we don't see race. We would love you whether you were black, yellow, white, green, polka dotted, purple. We would love you the same either way. And while their love may be the same, the experiences that we had based on our racial identity and our abilities to grow up and understand who we were very different. And so being an Asian child, being an Asian girl in a predominantly white, low-income area, I was immediately tracked into academics. And so I was told that I should join Destination Imagination, and did I know about the chess club and all these other super nerdy things. And especially my little brothers, were tracked into athletics. And so we don't have a big sports program. There is one high school, one middle school in my entire town. And yet this is the one time that high school coaches scouted at the middle school level my two little brothers, who were undersized. They're both pretty small they were small for their age and not super gifted in sports, although if they heard me say this, they would probably complain and say that they were the best. And it wasn't just the tracking and the positive things that kind of brought us to where we are, but it was also the bias and the assumptions that were made, and not intentionally. These, I would say, were unconscious. Our teachers were nice and they cared about us, and they had implicit bias. And so I was the small petite Asian girl who they assumed was going to be really smart. And so when I struggled, they put their arms around me and said, "You're going to be just fine. Don't worry about it," and gave me more help. By kindergarten, my little brother was diagnosed with ADHD. They were both told our parents were told that they were too rambunctious, too aggressive, too loud. And if you think about those terms that I just used, they will probably coincide with a lot of biases and language around anti-Blackness that we're hearing today, especially in the news, as young men and women are being murdered. And so we see those patterns persisting even then. And there was a history of this before them as well. And again, my teachers weren't terrible people. They weren't racist and mean, but they had unconscious and implicit bias. And so, and that in a lot of ways has a lot to do with where we ended up. We all worked really hard. We were taught from a young age that we had to work hard. And yet I ended up with a PhD before I was 30 from an R1 institution, which is incredibly prestigious, CU Boulder. And they are still working service jobs. And one has tried to go into college and wasn't able to make it. He would go in, realize he had to work, take a break, or his grades would slip, so he'd take a break and then he'd go back and try it again. It was constant in and out. And one has a GED and the other still doesn't have their high school diploma. And so we can see how, despite meritocracy, despite working hard, our paths were incredibly changed simply by race.
You know, it's fascinating because I've heard you share this story before, that you have such a front row experience and like a 360 view of how, you know, the education system can play such a big impact on the development of young people. And so I guess my question is, do you think that your experiences and the things that you saw impacted your decision to go into the PhD work that you decided to do?
No, that was a lot of luck, to be honest. I think that I unconsciously knew I wanted to work with students and for students. My sociology professor was incredibly good about giving me a lot of research opportunities early on. And so we had done some things with girls, and my assumption was I'd be in sociology, but I ended up in education. And so I was really focused on class because, again, I was raised colorblind. We're all the same. I had just worked harder than my siblings, and that's how I ended up where I was. And note the air quotes and the historic. If there was a thought bubble, I would be there. And so I didn't have a good perspective on race at that point. And a lot of what I learned was like even the internalized racism that I held around my Asian identity. And so in a lot of ways, I unintentionally learned the role that race played in my life. And once I started to see it, I couldn't unsee it. So.
I bet that was, how long do you think that process was for you when you realized, oh, wow, like I've been a part of a thought process that, when we talk about some of the systemic things that are happening in education, what was that journey like for you? And when did you wake up one day and go, whoa, I'm like part of this system? And I'll let you talk.
Yeah. It took a really long time for it to fully make sense. The moment that it clicked was actually later in my graduate program. I mean, I understood race. I didn't see myself as part of that equation or my siblings because a lot of times race was very unidimensional. We are talking about our African American kids. We are talking about our Latinx kids. We are talking about X, Y, and Z. Asians were rarely spoken about because of the model minority myth. And it was also very much a cultural difference. And so we looked at cultural differences a lot and the barriers that happen. And I said, but I don't have those barriers. I've always spoken English. And I grew up in white privilege. Like I know how to code switch. Like I don't know what code switching is because white is all I know. And so the moment that a really important moment that I realized, oh, race matters and it actually matters to me. It's not just the students that I'm working with who are real Asians, right? Or like real kids of color, because there's a term, racial imposter syndrome. And that happens when you discount your experience because it's not the norm. So because I'm adopted, I'm not really Asian. My parents didn't speak it. I'm not an immigrant. I didn't grow up eating Asian foods. I don't like kimchi. Like I'm not a real Asian. I'm not recognizing the fact that the world perceives me and interacts with me as Asian. And adoptee is just a piece of that identity that is going to be forever interconnected. But I can't get away from this Asian piece, even if I wanted to. But it really hit, and this was it took me a while to like understand where I fit in that puzzle. But it was when Black Lives Matters started. And I remember my little brother telling me a couple of years before, oh, I keep getting followed by the cops. And I said, well, if you didn't wear such baggy clothes and drive a crappy little car, you wouldn't be followed. Like just drive like a normal human, follow the rules, and don't mouth off. You'll be fine. Not recognizing that in Madison, Wisconsin, where it's predominantly white and upper middle class, like the racial bias is incredibly large and it's everywhere. And so it didn't matter what he drove. He could have drove a crappy car, in which case then he's reproducing that stereotype of thug or danger, or he could have driven a really nice car, in which case he would have been pulled over for, excuse me, son, did you steal that? Where'd you get that car? Right? And so regardless, It was a lose-lose situation, and it took me a number of years. Like, the story stuck with me, and I remember like being like, oh yeah, just play the game. And it wasn't until years later that I was able to start putting those pieces together, and how race was very present and played out in my life.
So one of the things that you really impacted in DPS was the belong groups. Like, you created that. And so what was the inspiration behind naming it belong groups, and what were some of the things you were hoping to accomplish with creating these affinity groups?
I wish I could give you an answer that it was well thought out and I had prepared and had all of these great insights. But it was happenstance, and it grew a life of its own. And when we think about community organizing, that really is what happened. And so Stacy DeVergstall was my leader and wanted me to lead these. This was part of her. She was an organizational development professional. And this was her vision. She had fought for it for years. Several members of my team actually were like, "We've tried this. It always flopped. It's never gonna take off." And despite that, Stacy really pushed, and that was a big part of the reason that she brought me on. Like, that was a big piece of my job. And I went, okay, let me figure this out. And it felt icky because it was like I was looking at all these business review models and trying to figure out what all of these other organizations were doing, and stumbled upon a fascinating article that was talking about not just creating spaces for people to belong, but also creating spaces for community organizing to happen. How can we allow groups of folks from marginalized backgrounds to not only come together and support, but also to influence the system and make more belongingness organizationally wide? And so rather than just like, and I'm not saying that support isn't necessary, but instead of just being like, yay, we're all together, it's yay, we're all together. What are things we want to change about the system? Mm-hmm. The name, when I first introduced this, and I remember sitting in the room, I got scorched. Like, the entire thing, like, people were cutting it down and ripping it apart. And I just remember being like, ugh, okay, what am I getting myself into? And the name, I had a number of different ideas, and I wanted it to make sure that it was empowering and strong. I think I had things like We the People or Solidarity or things like that didn't quite fit. I don't think it would have taken the same level of ownership by groups. And Sam Silver actually said, who was on the CELT team, who was our communications person, said, why don't we just do this? Easy, it's fresh, it's one word, and this is what you're trying to get at, right? And I was like, oh. And we took a vote, and it was like, it just fell into place. So
it's such a perfect name because it's something that we now use when we're talking to students and colleagues. Like, you belong here. Your voice matters, like, we want you here. We're better with you here. And it's funny because I know maybe the Asian Belong group was probably the toughest group because we just wanted to get together and socialize and eat. And like, you remember, I know we've had these conversations like, we don't want to organize. We just want to get together and eat. And like, and I mean, I think, but that speaks to, because I know you were advocating for us to get a food budget, because in the Asian culture, I mean, so much is around that. And that's what makes these different groups so unique and really cool, because that's part of understanding the differences between all of the groups, but your legacy is still going on. We did have another meeting without you, and we missed you. And I wore my shirt when I was leading the xenophobia conversation.
Oh,
so I'm like,
you saw that? Yep.
And I was like, I want to make Hannah proud. Like, I just want to do right by you. But So thinking about everything that's happening now, you know, like we talk a lot about the racial tensions in the Black community, but going to the Asian community and the things that we're seeing, um, with the work that you're doing at the state, have you heard any stories about xenophobia happening in Denver, or are you hearing it mostly like nationwide?
Mostly nationwide. There is the governor's racial equity COVID response team or something like that that's going on through the um, um, Office of Health and Equity. And so they're doing quite a bit of work. They are, of all of the departments in Colorado, they're the furthest along, I would say, and are doing some incredible things. But in terms of where I am sitting, there's not a lot of conversation, but there's also not a lot of, um, there's not a lot of venues for that either.
Mm. So I want to remind everybody that you are currently working for the state of Colorado Department of Labor and doing the equity work. So like, it's good to know that they found someone that really knows what they're doing to work. I don't know who was in that before, so it's not a dig on anybody, but knowing you, I think like they found like an amazing person to lead its work. So before we go, I always like to end on something upbeat and cheery. What is something that is bringing you joy during this time and putting a smile on your face?
I am loving the warmth and the heat of summer. Um, I think that's something, and this isn't meant to um, sound overbearing, but I think the level of equity conversations that I've been able to have with things slowing down, people are being able to be really intentional and thoughtful about where they're prioritizing their time and what matters to them. And so I've seen a number of folks, for instance, in the ultimate community, one of the leaders cares about equity and racial justice, and says, I coach so much that sometimes it takes over, and like I don't have enough time to do equity work. And so it's giving people that time to digest and decide where's your time, where's your passion, and having great conversations like these, and getting to see people really stopping to think um, about what some of these inequities mean that they're seeing in their own towns, in their own spaces, in their own communities.
Man, Hannah, you are amazing. And I just want to say before we go, I did go back to that one restaurant you took me to that had the great food that was around the corner from DPS admin.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone there a couple times.
Nice.
I thought the food's great. So thanks.
D-Bar.
Z-Bar.
Yep.
Thanks for introducing me to that. And I hopefully when things open up and it's safe to get together, I'd love to have a meal with you again and catch up. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed seeing you. I miss you in DPS.
I miss you too.
But I know you're only a phone call away.
Very close.
So, hey, stay well, and my best to you and your hubby, and just keep doing what you're doing and rocking it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for creating this space. I think it's that's such a gendered thing to start a sentence, but it is so important for Asians to see themselves in all of their nuance. And so this is a beautiful space you've created. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. You as well. Bye.